This tutorial is for people who want to make a podcast for their Module 2 project. It's going to cover how to work with a digital audio workspace interface, which is what you see in front of you right now. We'll talk about how to get a good recording with using things like EQ, noise gates, and compression to enhance the sound of your voice. And we'll also talk about editing and how to structure a podcast in a way that makes what you're doing accessible to your listener. So to start with, this is a digital audio workspace, also called a DAW. When you open up GarageBand, it's going to prompt you to make a new project. You can choose empty project. And then it gives you a number of different options for, how you want to do this. But we're going to choose record with a microphone. Simply because we're not looking to make music here. We're just looking to record your voice. So you can hear there was some feedback. I'm going to turn my monitor off. That's this switch right here. That outputs the audio through my speaker system, and when that happens, it feeds into my microphone and then creates a feedback loop between the two that creates that ear-piercing noise. So you are also going to want to turn your monitor off for this unless you are wearing headphones while you record, which I am not right now because I want you to be able to hear my audio. What we're trying to do is create a podcast. And so when I start off with a new project here, the first thing I like to do is to just sort of get my workspace set up in a way that's comfortable for me. So right now we probably don't need our media library. So we can go to this view tab right here and we can hide that. Other things that you might want to know, your editing menu is useful, mostly because it shows you the keyboard shortcuts for all the editing things that you'll want to do. These are your track options. We don't need to do anything with this right now, but however, learning the key commands for a new track and duplicating a track and deleting a track are, it's helpful. Again, these programs are used primarily to record music, so you'll have to remember you don't want to have a metronome and you don't want to have any kind of count-in or anything like that. From here, you don't necessarily need to get into this until much later in the process. This is how you'll export your stuff, and again, this is how you control your setup. So right now I want to see the track, I want to see the waveform when we start recording, and I also want to make sure that I have my sound settings available to me here. You'll see more about that once we record something. So, of course, there's a lot of pre-prep that goes into creating something like this. I wouldn't be just kind of starting cold off the cuff like I am here because this is just a tutorial video. But rather I would probably not have a script either. So you kind of want to be, I think, in a place where you have a good structure in mind in general, and then you're able to fill that structure with authentic conversation, which is really difficult to do. You can do this, of course, by incorporating collaborators, and that makes it so much easier. If you find other people who have your area of expertise and like to talk about it, and you can record conversations with them, that, of course, is a lot more dynamic and engaging. But some people do carry podcasts entirely on their own, and ultimately it will depend on what you decide to do conceptually with your podcast. That will, to some degree, determine the structure of the podcast. But what we're going to work with today is kind of just a general idea about what a podcast is. And so the podcast probably has an intro. Maybe that intro involves some bumper music, and we'll talk about how to put bumper music into the project. Maybe the podcast is split up after that into kind of segments. Some of those segments repeatable, some of them, things that are fresh for that episode, So For instance, a comic might have maybe a segment in their podcast where they go through some headlines or something like that. And maybe they do that once every episode with different headlines and try to come up with some good jokes. So, and, maybe like a music podcast, maybe if you wanted to analyze a song, you would be sort of starting with, describing the music. And then after that, you'd probably want to talk about like the performances and then the mix and then maybe some of the lyrics and songwriting after that. And you might divide the podcast up that way. That's what I mean when I say that the idea will somewhat structurally determine what the podcast will kind of look like. So I'm just going to cover now how to do the basic things. Record your voice, get a good sound on your voice, and, figure out how to edit and start to give this thing a little bit of structure or identity. So your, record panel, there's, key commands that you can learn for these too, but your record panel up here is, very simple to use. You don't have to worry about any of this stuff here, but since we probably want to know, roughly how long things are taking, we probably do want to, have the timer on. So to start recording, you just hit this red button there. And now you're going to see that as I speak, what I'm saying is coming across directly visually on the screen now as a waveform. And so once we stop recording, we'll have that snippet of my voice to listen back to. So once we have some of our voice, and whether this is part of the podcast that you're recording or, just something that you're doing specifically for this reason, you can use this handy little loop tool right here and just stretch it out to the part that you want to loop, and it'll just play this over and over again. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the loop play, and I'm going to make some adjustments, and I'm going to tell you about the adjustments that I'm making as I make them. So we're going to start with EQ, and you can see there's some representation of EQ right here. It essentially, this waveform here, it allows you to control what sounds are most and least expressed. So these are your high frequencies, your mid frequencies, your low frequencies. And this is the most, basic way that you can understand this, but it's also all that you need to understand for what we're doing here. But we're actually going to use a different tool. Down here where it says plugins, you can click on that arrow right there, and then they have you set up with this channel EQ. And you'll see that how this works is that you use these sliders here to create different peaks at different levels of hertz. And that allows you to control the expression of the sound. So I'm going to let my voice play for a little while, and I'm just going to EQ it and show you the frequencies that I try to bring out in my voice when I record something like this. You just hit this red button there, and now you're going to see that as I speak, what I'm saying is... See, that's a little tinny. I don't think that's a flattering range for my voice. So I'm going to come away from that one and try the next range down. Just hit this red button there, and now you're going to see that as I speak, what I'm saying is coming across directly visually on the screen now as a waveform. And so once we stop recording... So this one here at 100 hertz gave my voice a little bit more of a clearer bass tone to it. Coming across directly. So I'm going to slide this one down a little. On the screen now as a waveform. And so once we stop recording, then you just hit this. That brings the frequency up. And now you're going to see that as I speak. And that gives it a little bit more depth. Coming across directly visually on the screen now as a waveform. And so not much of my voice is up in this range. You can hear I changed that significantly. It doesn't sound very, very different. So my voice isn't really there. So I'm just going to turn this one off. Directly visually on the screen now as a waveform. I am here. Once we stop recording, then you just hit this red button there. And now you're going to see that as I speak. This sounds a little too meaty. Coming across directly visually on the screen now as a waveform. And so once we stop recording, then you just hit this red button. That sounds pretty nice. And now you're going to Let's turn it off. Speak, what I'm saying is coming across directly visually on the screen now as a waveform. So you can hear a significant difference, and I just made a couple of small changes, not too much. If you want to boost the overall volume of your voice too, you can boost the gain. But what you want to watch out for is, what you might be hearing a little bit in this video because of the way I'm recording it, so that you can hear the audio feedback. Some of the audio starts to sound what they call fried if you turn it up too loud, which means you start to distort the sound.
And you just hit this red button there, and now you're going to see that as I speak, what I'm saying is coming across directly visually on the screen now as a waveform. And
so yeah, I'm going to give it some plus 3 decibels of gain there. And next I'm going to think about, I don't know that necessarily we need to gate my voice here. The noise gate is this. Essentially, it blocks out ambient noise and isolates the one sound that you're trying to hear.
And you just hit this red button there, and now you're going to see that as I speak, what I'm saying is coming across.
So if you bring the noise gate all the way up, it restricts the frequency to 0, so you can't hear
Stop
anything.
Recording. And you just hit this red button there, and now you're going to see that as I speak, what I'm saying is coming across directly visually on the screen now as a wave. So once we stop recording, then you just hit this red button there.
So yeah,
now you're going to see.
You can hear the difference there, where the gate just kind of isolates the waveform and cuts away extraneous noise so that you just hear the one thing. I actually like how that sounds, so I'm going to keep it. The last thing I'm going to do here is just dial in some compression. So compression compresses the waveform. It just restricts the sonic range of the sound to give it a more kind of like focused sound.
And you just hit this red button there, and now you're going to see that as I speak, what I'm saying is coming across directly visually on the screen now as a wave.
So that sounds too compressed to me. However, when we're in this range
here,
you
just hit this red button there, and now you're going to see that as I speak, what I'm saying is coming across directly visually on the screen now as a wave. So once we stop recording, then you just hit this red button there, and now you're going to.
This definitely takes some of the fry off the top end of the sound, and I think gives it kind of like a nice sort of full sound. I'm also mixing this, at loud volume, which you want to do because you don't want to mix the whole thing and then realize like, oh, well, hey, no one can hear it at the volume that I mixed it at. There are other options that you can play with, and honestly, this program is a lot of fun to just kind of mess around with. But we need to learn how to do some basic things in order to put a podcast together. So we know that podcasts are, broken up into sections. And so, you'll probably record some raw audio that needs to be edited. But also, too, you might want to edit some things out that have made their way into the recording that you don't want there. This is a way to shorten your podcast. When I used to record podcasts, we would have, for one particular podcast I was making, we would usually have anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours of raw audio. And just from cutting out all of, like the ums and ahs and, just tightening the spaces between things, I was able to take reliably 40 minutes off of the podcast, just doing that stuff. And not even then making choices about like, okay, what are we leaving in? What are we taking out? But editing is, a crucial part of the process. So I want to show you how to do that here. It's pretty simple.
And you just hit this red button there. And now you're going to see that as I speak, what I'm saying is...
All right. So I did a... kind of thing right there while I was trying to think of what I was going to say next. That's this little guy right here. I want to get rid of it. I'm going to press Command T because that's how I do it. It doesn't seem like they have that option up there. So Command T, that's the way. And then I'm going to come to what I think is the end of that sound. I'm going to get rid of that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to match the two pieces. Now, if you want to make sure you're really snugging them up tight, You can magnify the waveform like that. If you want to make it much, much, much bigger and just make sure there's no space there, that's a clean edit. Looks good. Let's hear how it sounds.
You just hit this red button there. I speak. What I'm saying is coming across directly.
So you can still hear a little bit of it, but it sounds much, much better. If I wanted to get that little small vocal affectation out of there, then I could again make this much louder and then see if I can isolate where it stops. I imagine it's here. Well, when do I start to say the word?
Coming across.
Yep. So right here, again, Command T, highlight it, hit delete, and then I'm going to back these up against one another, and we'll see how that sounds. Yeah. Whoop. Not quite what we wanted to do there. Yeah, there's still a gap. Let me back these up a little more.
Then you just hit this red button there. And now you're going to see that as I speak, what I'm saying is coming across directly, visually on the...
Now to me, that sounds too abrupt now. It doesn't sound natural. So I'm going to want to undo those edits I just did. Just Command Z. So yeah, just Command Z until you get back to what you had before you made that last edit.
I speak. What I'm saying is coming across directly.
Now, you know, it still sounds a little bit abrupt, but it definitely sounds more natural than when I took the full kind of vocal sound out. So maybe if I wanted to, I could just put a little bit of space between them like that and see how that plays.
Is, coming across directly.
I think that sounds the best. So now I don't want to have to deal with that space every time I make other edits. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to combine these two. So you're going to hit Command J. It's going to ask you if you want to create a new audio file, and you're going to do that.
Is coming across directly.
So there you go. That's how to edit. Those are the basic things that you need to know how to do in order to edit a podcast. Let's think about, you know, structure now. So I'm not going to record an example intro, but you know, the very first thing that you've got to do is let people know what they're listening to, who you are, and then what the thing that you are making is about. So generally you start by welcoming people to the podcast. You say the title of the podcast. You talk about yourself, what your role is. You probably announce if you're going to have any guests or anything like that. Maybe you tease a segment later on in the podcast to get people interested in listening to the full podcast. And if you want to go this far into the kind of rhetorical simulation game here, if you want to, for instance, make up, you know, ad reads or even just copy ad reads from podcasts that you listen to, you can certainly work those in if you want to. I've had students in the past who have done that and made up their own ads, and they were quite funny. So once you know how to record audio and make your voice sound good and kind of do these, you know, different editing tricks, all of that stuff becomes, you know, a possibility, something you can do. The last thing we're going to cover is multiple tracks here. So let's say that I've got some additional sound that I want to get into the podcast. I'm going to do that on a different track so that I can control the relationship between the sounds as much as possible. So let's say that I want to put some bumper music at the beginning of my podcast. And so one thing that I'm going to do here is just use a demo that I made in GarageBand as some bumper music. You'll probably recognize it based on some of the YouTube videos for the channel. I didn't make it for that. I just kind of made it and then, you know, had it around. So I started using it for this stuff. But yeah, so I would play the audio and hear what's there. And then just choose a starting point. Choose where I think would be a good place for the sound to start. So yeah, it's got to be that. You know, the drone at the beginning is, you know, just not interesting enough to sustain somebody's attention for as long as it lasts in a context like this. For a song, it could be fine. But for a context like this, we're going to want a little more. And I don't think that audio should also just be just statically that same set of sounds. I think there should be some kind of, dynamic moment that we're looking for. So all right, so the song finally started to do something interesting. I don't think we want to have our audience wait 38 seconds before they start to hear something interesting there. So let's again change our starting point. See, I think that's a little too quick for the big dynamic shift there. So why don't we bring it back to... should be here. Yeah, that's it. So we're going to come to 14 seconds here. I'm going to make a cut. And you know what? I'm going to shrink this back down again so it's all easier to work with. I'm going to move that over. All right, so I'm probably not going to want much more than 25 seconds here for this sound. So I can make a cut, get rid of the rest of it, back the voice up, not exactly to the end of the song, but a little bit before it, actually. And you know what? Now that I'm looking at this visually, I'm going to extend that a little bit. So... that's another thing you can do with these regions is you can drag and extend them. You can also loop them as well. So if you wanted just this to play over and over and over again, when it gets to the end of it, it will just go back to the beginning. Which is, for our purposes here, not what we want to do, but instead what we want to do is come back up to this mix area here and select Show Automation. And we want to manipulate the volume of this here. So we want it to fade in and fade out. So we're going to need 4 points. In the waveform. And we are going to have to get that all the way out. And let's do this one about halfway. And see how that sounds. Alright, we can do a little more with that. Let's put it to here. So now it's going to gradually get louder. And right when that change happens, it's at its loudest volume. I'm going to unmute this track now.
Then you just hit this red button there. And now you're going to see that as I speak, what I'm saying is...
So you can have that nice kind of overlapping transition. You know, it would sound better if I were saying something like, welcome to the podcast, or something like that. Over that, you can still further manipulate this. Let's say that you want to start it to fade out earlier. You just move this back. And that's really basically all you need to know are those controls right there. How to record your voice, how to EQ your voice, how to apply a little bit of a gate and some compression. And then from that point on, how to edit different parts of the podcast to create some structure, and how to manipulate the position and volume of certain tracks on, a multiple track setup so that you can kind of bring a little bit of finesse to your production. So yeah, that's the video. Happy podcasting. If you have any questions, post them on the Discord. We could talk about them.